This is an extraordinary sage's not-so-ordinary adventure by Redfist Canon. This is the final part of this story. Link is in the description.
Connecticut, 29th of September, 2000. Hades rarely felt frustrated. Annoyed, that was practically his default setting. Angry, only whenever his stupid brothers were involved. Frustrated, that would imply he repeatedly failed a task he set out to do, something that rarely occurred, and yet, also the same thing that's been happening for the last half an hour. Namely, skewering a certain masked man. Stay still, you insect. The god punctuated each word with a stab of his bident. Bahahaha, stoden aim ya goat dear laddie. The man dodged each attack by twirling around it or blocked it with his large sword. Yes, Hades was restraining himself. Yes, he didn't want his brothers to badger him. Yes, his opponent was genuinely skilled and required the effort he could spare without outing himself. But did the little knave have to be so tartarus damned annoying? From keeping up the obviously forced Scottish accent to the repeated taunts he was spewing, the only thing that'd make this more childish was neener neener. Was he seriously shaking his behind like a monkey? No. Damn him to the pit and back, he'll be shoving that stupid mortal in a brazen bowl before cursing him with immortality. Or scaphism, that would do nicely. It was one of the things he'd loved about Persia. Or, as long as he was going east, how about Linkchi? He'll figure it out after separating that snotter's soul from his body. And if eviscerating this little bug meant bringing Zeus after him, he'll deal with it. So with that thought, for the first time in the fight, Hades let loose. Olympus, Athena's temple, same time. Athena paced around her office, while a nervous Apollo and Artemis fidgeted in their chairs. Sister, the huntress raised a tentative hand. AP, the wise goddess cut her off. Look, Athena, the other twin tried his luck. Pap, the black-haired goddess raised a finger to stop him. Is there anything I can do? Artemis spoke only to get interrupted again. You've done enough, sister, Athena began, but seeing her sister's frown she backpedaled. I apologize, I didn't mean to be harsh about this, but please let me do the thinking. For now, this isn't an easy situation to get out of, she explained while the twins simultaneously rubbed their arms. It's been several hours since the sun god's return, and with it, came the confirmation that the biggest security threat in the last 2 millennia had been gallivanting around their territory. Even if, from what Apollo said, the sage or Naruto as she'd learned he was called, and his son were not out to oppose them or cause mayhem in their lands, it didn't change the fact that their presence alone would be viewed as a threat. Plus, with this revelation, several pieces suddenly fell into place. From the anomalies at Medusa's lair, the monster's disappearance, the entire Demeter fiasco, and if her sentinels were to be believed, Hestia's brief disappearance. It all simply clicked. Having the sun god ask his Shinto counterpart questions was the equivalent of putting the goddess under a polygraph test. Her answers had been the absolute truth, and the information Apollo had relayed was a blessing, even if she agreed the sun goddess could have kept some of the more strange details to herself. She wasn't going to be calling anyone a daddy's girl, though, especially considering she and Artemis had their father similarly wrapped around their fingers. But unlike her own father, she hoped that man would be as passive as the Shinto goddess had told them. Because while Athena usually didn't mind her sister's attitude, disrespecting the sage to his face like that, even if Artemis didn't know, could have ended with a disaster. I just hope his lack of reaction isn't some ploy to get back at us, thought the goddess of war. The most alarming fact about all of this was the father and son's possible involvement in intruding her aunt's garden. That fact alone implied they were able to somehow make their way to Olympus, stayed long enough to raid the garden several times, and remained unnoticed through it all by everyone. Or maybe, an idea struck her. That's right, while she had initially given her oldest aunt's disappearance no concern, since Hestia tended to do so often, the timing of her absence coupled with what Athena knew of her abilities was too coincidental. She's a passive empath, she couldn't not have noticed an intruder. But that still leaves her with several questions. Why even bother with coming to Olympus if the two foreigners didn't intend to start something? Precautionary measures. From what? One was already a pantheonic threat. Plus, that would contradict their recent actions. What with taking in demigods, especially her little Annabeth, and risking to be put under the Olympians' watch? On the other hand, there was some merit to that theory. The Jade Emperor was still classified as a pantheonic threat as well, but curiously enough, the deity had not done anything to show for that title since the Heavenly War. It's almost like they're relying on their past reputations to put up a facade. Could the sage be doing the same? And could Amaterasu's disarming statements actually be an attempt to protect her supposed father, rather than avoid conflict with them? But more importantly, was she willing to take the risk of confronting the man? As confident as she was in a fight, if the sage was as powerful as his reputation suggested, then she deigns not to imagine a scenario in which she'd win. Sending a part of herself was an option, but if things go south, she'd need to be at full power. What then? Talk to the duo directly and ask them to go away. That could cause them to lash out, she thought. Talk to Zeus and hope he didn't overreact. You know he will, her mind supplied unhelpfully. She couldn't blame him, however. She was sure everyone but herself, Hestia, and possibly Hephaestus would have a pronounced reaction, especially Ares. As much as she'd want her brother to, as he'd say so crudely, get his shit pushed in, she'd prefer not to drag her entire family down with him in the process. Krakabam. The loud boom of Zeus' thunder echoed across Olympus, startling the three gods. What now? Athena shelved her thoughts and gestured for her siblings, who had been silently letting her think, to accompany her out. Hopefully, it wouldn't be what she feared. Connecticut, with Hades and Naruto's clone, haha. Ria-chan's got some pretty strong kiddos. Those were Naruto's thoughts as he saw a portion of the forest get vaporized by his opponent's flames. Good thing he'd lured the god some distance away from the house, even if he was sure the boss and his lady friend would still be feeling the ground shaking. As the clone resumed an exchange of blows with the deity, his thought drifted. The clone was more than pleased with Hades' performance so far. He'd be lying if he said he didn't expect a brute with a penchant for big flashy attacks, just like Yama 7 had been. When it comes to the Taoist death god, though, that giant tub of lard more than made up for his lackluster technique with a particularly annoying ability and monstrous reserves and durability. All of this made Yama almost as hard to fight as his brother Okwam. There was also the Shinigami or even the goddess, Kali 8 to consider, but the sage, for the life of him, could not recall ever seeing the two deities fight anyone, even if he knew for a fact that the first would have given him a run for his money while the other was just a smidge weaker than the freaking Trimurti, what with her ability to keep powerful demons like Mara 9 imprisoned in Naraka 10. Most of the time, that bastard always slipped out somehow and tried causing trouble. But yeah, the crux of the matter was, the eldest of the big three was a pretty skilled and versatile fighter. He might not be showing the same power output as the aforementioned death gods, but Naruto knew he was restraining himself and controlling his attacks. If anything, that added to the stealthy fighting style he had adopted, one that the clone would have compared to a shinobi's. Yeah, the helm was a bit annoying. It messed with his senses by making the god almost undetectable by conventional means. But the sage was anything but conventional. Madara and those weird-ass clones of his gave Boss and Sasuke trouble back in the day. The clone reminisced briefly at the memory of his creator's first friend and surrogate brother. Boom. He was cut off by a massive shockwave, one that uprooted the very earth around them and forced the clone to backpedal. Naruto, do something. A voice identical to his spoke in mind. What now? Looking back, the blonde's eyes widened as he saw the fissures in the ground closer to the house. Shit. The barrier would mean nothing if the entire cliff collapsed. Before he could do anything, his instinct screamed at him to block a violent thrust from Hades. One that was followed by an array of fireballs, which he blocked with a quickly hardened mud wall. The god didn't give him any reprieve, pressing his advantage even more and forcing the clone back on the now cracked ground. Samahata cackled in his hand as each hit let her absorb a bit more of Hades' energy. Naruto doubted it'd do much good at this point though, since his opponent wasn't letting up his assault. The clone needed an opening. Or maybe he needed to stop playing around. Screw this, he thought with a bit of frustration. Strength, the blonde yelled. His body glowed a pale yellow, as he felt every muscle tense up and grow more powerful. With a roar, he reared back the blunt sword and used it to bat away Hades. The hit connected, it was blocked, and the god flew back. Along with everything in the vicinity. A shockwave was created from the impact, one that uprooted the ground and the few remaining trees in front of Naruto, creating so much devastation that the forest now looked like a stone quarry. Ah, I overdid it, he looked to the side guiltily. I'm gonna have to replant this forest later. The clone did not dwell on the destruction he inadvertently caused through lack of restraint. Instead, his body glowed a dark green hue as he raised a foot and slammed it to the ground. Wood, he yelled again. This time, energy was released in a ripple that traveled through the entire forest and up to the cliff. Even with over half the forest burnt to the ground, the organic matter could still be used. With but a thought, Naruto had supercharged and commanded every bit of flora between him and the Castellan home. Immediately, a thick root system formed in the ground, making its way through the cracked earth and holding its pieces together. In a few seconds, it reached the house, just as the latter began tilting back into the sea, and formed a solid wooden platform under it. It took at most 30 seconds for it all to happen, but the house was kept stabilized before it could be toppled. As opposed to spending a considerable amount of chakra to create an entire wooden structure from scratch much like Hashirama would have done, just using enough energy to connect to the appropriate domain for a few instants was a much better alternative. Yes sir, great decision making indeed. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the clone's inner self-congratulatory thoughts. So you can use other domains. Who know? What are you? The question came from Hades, who was creeping closer, looking no worse for wear, even if his armor was a bit dirtied. Huh, so he finally took off that helm. The clone looked at his opponent for the first time and scrutinized his features. Wow, so Hestia ain't the only one that inherited good looks from her ma, thought the blonde. He wasn't surprised to see that the deity supported quite the handsome features but didn't dwell much on it. From the looks of things, the god was reevaluating his approach and walked calmly to the blonde. Maybe he was willing to talk things out. Just in case, Naruto mentally sent the original Naruto an inquiry on the progress. I'm almost done, no thanks to you, the original replied snidely. Oh come on, you said to distract him. I did, the clone complained. Your carelessness gave Ria-chan a scare. Naruto roared back. PFF'd Alric. The clone relented. I'll stall a bit more then see if I can bring Deadman inside. You do that, the original agreed. Deciding to abandon the charade now that it wasn't needed anymore, and settle for the regular old Uzumaki charm, the clone grinned before connecting to the sound domain. The approaching god stopped in surprise when the man before him adopted a pose while the air around them carried the sound of kabuki music. I'm glad you asked, he yelled before raising a foot and jumping to the other, as a platform akin to a pedestal rose under him to elevate him. I'm the sage that hails from distant lands. He waved his hands around in rhythm with the tempo. Gifted with a terrific sense of humor and the immortal wisdom of a hermit, I am the envy of men and women across the world, he said as he removed the tribal mask. I am. He paused for effect, while mentally connecting with yet another domain in preparation for the big finale. Uzumaki IIIINNARUTOOOOO. He announced with a massive shit-eating grin. Thunder boomed for an extra dramatic effect. Hey pervy sage, eat your heart out, thought the clone, referring to his long-deceased teacher. While his more questionable habits were a big no-no for the sage, the world needed Jiraiya's brand of eccentricity and showmanship. It was just too good to forget about. Silence reigned on the clearing after that, while the clone remained in the same position, his face frozen in his gleeful expression. Hades gazed at the spectacle blankly. Who? Naruto almost fell over from the shock. Oh come on, it's me, you know, the sage heir, from the east. The blonde pointed to himself with a surprised expression. The gallant sage of the east. Hades raised a brow. His question made the clone snap his hands into a pair of finger guns and wink at the black-haired deity. Ayup, that. Naruto heard Hades snort. Do you take me for a fool? Sure you may have some skills, but your energy levels are honestly pathetic. The god sported a deadpan expression. The blonde jumped from his pedestal and marched towards the god, scowling all the while until he was up in the latter's face. Well, down under, since Hades was half a foot taller so Naruto had to look up to meet the god's gaze. Out of pettiness, the clone willed a foot-tall pedestal to rise under him just so he could look down at the deity. Oi, cruisin' for a bruisin' boyo. Also, that's only because I'm a clone, he pointed a finger accusingly at the dead god. Hades once again raised a brow, both at the statement and the childishness of the blonde's antics. Ah, so I take it your original is the one messing with my curse? The god inquired. Yay wait, that was your doing, Naruto yelled in Hades' face, prompting him to lean back, still sporting a deadpan expression. And what of it? You little brat, do you have any idea what that poor woman is going through? Yes, that was the point of my curse. Naruto could practically feel the cheekiness in that tone. Oh ho ho ho, boy am I gonna enjoy knocking the lip out of ya. The clone waved a finger patronizingly in the god's face. I'm shaking in my boots, spoke Hades with a bored tone seemingly unbothered by the lack of respect. Something tells me you don't believe me, Naruto narrowed his eyes on the god. No, really, Hades, answer dripped with mockery. This irritated the clone. Why I oughta rumble. Huh, what now? Asked Naruto. Just as the clone finished the statement, the smell of ozone assaulted his nose. Something that the god before him also detected since he uttered a brief curse and summoned a dark shield. Before Naruto could say anything, the area was struck by a massive bolt of lightning, and everything went white. Half-Blood Hill. What am I supposed to do in this situation? Thought the green-haired immortal. He stood at a somewhat safe distance from the goddess, who was still shielding herself with Greek fire, and rubbed his neck awkwardly as questions racked his brain. How long was Hestia going to do this? Why was she even doing this? And more importantly, why did this scene somehow feel familiar to him? Alright, think Zetsu. Did she get hurt on the way here? Unlikely, he'd have felt any injury she'd sustained before she did. Did someone say something to her? Again, unlikely. Hestia didn't seem the type to get so upset over words. Unless they were vulgar. Ah, the Uzumaki shuddered upon remembering the bitter taste of soap on his tongue. So what if his vocabulary was a bit colorful? Pops certainly didn't care, unless small children were around, and his siblings weren't any better. Except for Quatsi, but then again, his little sister's brand of abuse leaned toward a more physical approach. That's not even bringing up Amaterasu, who took the term roasting and applied it figuratively and literally to everything and everyone that annoyed her. Actually, thinking about it, even his aunts and uncles weren't innocent of this, especially Shukaku and Kurama. His youngest and oldest uncles used to verbally assault each other at every opportunity before the rest of the family intervened. Something about Origuk's youth almost getting into a gang war through emulating their idols. Whatever. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. The only thing that could have made Hestia act like that would be their trip here. Did his stomach really smell that bad? Nah, he'd never gotten any complaints before. After all, it wasn't the first time he'd temporarily swallowed people. Oh. So it's about the Kronos incident. Huh, wait, that doesn't explain it. Didn't it happen thousands of years ago? So why is she still hung up on it? Thought the greenette. Zetsu just didn't get it. It happened. Hestia and her siblings got out of it fine. She should be moving on. Right. He certainly did so. Even after the horrors of the Heavenly War, the Uzumaki had all but shrugged off the trauma and the memories of almost being killed several times. But Pops didn't. A part of his brain reminded him. Right. It was the whole reason behind creating Mole in Plain Sight to come here. Because his father was still hung up on the past and didn't want to repeat it. Zetsu for his part didn't care much anymore. They won, they learned from the experience, and they kept moving forward. That's how he spent most of his life. Except. But I didn't do anything wrong, Pops. She started crying for no reason. Don't matter if there is a reason, boyo, you need to fix it. But why? She'll get over it. I do. That's because you have a strong attitude. But you need to understand, Zetsu-chan, you're the oldest. I don't get it, how does being born first saddle me with more responsibility? It's a rule of nature. Parents gotta look out for their kids, and older siblings look out for the younger ones. Your Uncle Kurama, as grumpy as he is, cares for all of us that way. Is that why he always yells at you? Bahahaha. That's cause he wants people to think he's a tough guy. Truth is, your uncle is a huge softy that loves all his brothers and sisters, and that's why he's so protective of us. So what do I have to do? Hug him, support him, help them stand on their own feet. Just protect their smiles. That's your duty as the big brother. Yeah. Looking at the whimpering goddess, in Zetsu's mind's eye, her form was briefly overshadowed by the image of another deity. A young girl with black hair and amethyst tearful eyes, crying while holding onto something. Ama-chan, his mind supplied, remembering his little sister. Right. Pops didn't raise no bum. With a deep breath, Zetsu marched forward while inwardly chanting a mantra, first son, first son, first son. He got closer to Hestia, looked at his hands, and with a bit of reluctance, spread his arms out, before kneeling towards the goddess. First son, first son, first Suahh. The Uzumaki screamed internally. Just like before, as he came into contact with the green flames, they spread out on his body and began eating away at him. First son, he yelled internally and shakily brought his burning arms down towards Hestia's form. Hestia, for her part, was reliving memories she had long since buried. Her father's large hand grasping her small struggling form, his hot breath washing over her as his jaw opened to fit her entire body in, her mother's wails at the cruel betrayal, and lastly, the mute darkness that had choked her for days before she was joined by her. Since then, she had to suppress her own fear and act as a pillar of support for her family. Normal children would typically never remember the first few years of their lives. That wasn't the case for her. Hestia, even as a newborn, had inherited the gift of empathy from her mother. Just as emotions concerning specific events tended to anchor themselves in one's subconscious, the same phenomenon was magnified when it came to the goddess of family. In some ways, remembering so much about hers and her family's lives had both blessed and cursed her. She was able to forge an infinitely closer bond to her siblings, cousins, nephews, and the rest of their large family tree. She could truly help them and be the elder they all needed. Unfortunately, that meant enduring all the pain and hurt that came from their decisions, her father's actions chief among them. She could usually ignore it, as she had long since learned to shove it back into the deepest parts of her subconscious. But she still had specific triggers that could reel back those haunting memories onto the surface. Getting eaten again was among those. So she panicked. All rational thought had been put on the side burner. She'd let her instincts command her and lashed out. Heschog. A faint voice echoed in her mind as she retreated further into herself. Never again. Hestia, snap out of it. The same voice echoed again, but she paid it no heed. She would never be subjected to this treatment again. Tia, please. The voice sounded weaker than before. Why was it pleading? And why did it sound familiar? Suddenly, a small weight pressed against her, and a pair of things encircled her. Strangely enough, she felt no fear of it, quite the opposite. In fact, she ironically felt warmer. This was a hug, and quite the awkward one at that, her mind rationalized, what with all the trembling. Sis Tia, calm, the voice was feeble, almost gone now. Who was this? What was the last thing she had been doing? Why was she trembling again? It hit her. Ishmi, oh by Olympus. Her eyes relit as she blearily looked to the side, only to gasp as she saw her fellow immortal, barely holding onto her. Zetsu. Her flaming eyes flashed in recognition and she dispelled her flames immediately. The Uzumaki fell forward, half his body crumbling into ash as the goddess cradled his already regenerating torso tenderly and hugged him tightly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The deity couldn't help but cry at the greenette state. She did this. She hurt him. Oh heavens. Oh, she was such a screw-up. She was pat. Zetsu coughed and chuckled dryly at her surprised stare, his now healed palm resting on her soft brown locks. Hey, glad to have ya back, sis Tia, the Uzumaki said with a small smile. She would have lashed out at the headpath had it not been for the relief that overtook her earlier fear. Zetsu would be okay. She'd be okay too, but she didn't want to let go for now. Hugs were nice. Chapter 24. A peculiar series of sounds filled the battlefield. From the air, a battle raged between the sage and the emperor. To the distant observer, it would look akin to a giant firework display, unheard of at this time. To the close observer, however, they'd be lucky not to get vaporized from the barrage of shockwaves that ripped the land asunder. Naruto's golden form shined as he flew around the launched rocks and energy attacks. He answered in kind, his hands blurring as he threw every elemental variation of the Rasengan at his distant foe. Unfortunately, while the sage favored a strategy combining evasion with offensive maneuvers, the Jade Emperor seemed keen on staying in one place. Either blocking Naruto's attacks through an invisible barrier or veering them away from him. The sage did notice, however, that his enemy could not defend himself and attack at the same time. The Jade Emperor only ever threw his attacks in the brief instance between Naruto's own. When it comes to the latter, the blonde could only really deal with the gravity-based ones. Meteors being brought from orbit weren't that unfamiliar to him or hard to cut up when one knew how to hit them. The same couldn't be said about the red energy spheres. His body was already working overtime in healing the passive damage this strong force was doing to him, if the light shedding of his hair and the nosebleed he was sporting were any indicators. Those orbs of cosmic energy were close in resemblance to something the sage had seen whenever his gaze had gone up to the sky above, far beyond the veils every pantheon put up to draw those small constellations of theirs. It was the same signature he'd seen come out of distant star clusters, or more precisely, one that came as a result of the deaths of these astral bodies. Add to this the nonsensical power to simply manipulate an attack's momentum. This made it nigh impossible to get close enough to the red-headed deity, let alone damage him. Speed and clones could only do so much when the enemy just couldn't be approached long enough for close combat. So it all came down to a contest of stamina. One that Naruto would have normally been confident about winning, given his monstrous chakra reserves. Had he not have the latter to deal with the Jade Emperor's troublesome son. Clang. From the ground, the sound of flesh striking metal was heard. Arden was pushed back, skidding a small distance before stopping himself and shrugging off the blow. He ruffled his spiky white hair, adjusting the small crown that lay in it before his red eyes turned to his opponent. A tall muscular frame hidden partially under black ceremonial robes with golden accents, coupled with striking facial features. He, like many of his kind, cut an imposing yet strangely beautiful figure even as he advanced towards the sage. Why? The god spoke, breaking the tense silence. Why what? Naruto answered, golden eyes narrowed, and body set in the strong fist stance. His body is strange, thought the blonde. It looks, feels, and acts like flesh, but there's no mistake I'm hitting some type of metal here. Why persist? The much taller immortal clarified, your power is already lower than Lord Father's, even whole, and yet, you've decided to decrease your non-existent chances of winning, and for what? A gaggle of Yi one who fled their duties. The brat was right in a way. Using something like the fission technique was a gamble, especially when faced with such strong opponents. But he couldn't afford to waste chakra on shadow clones and still needed to divide his attention between both gods. His opponent was close to him now, standing at almost 2 heads taller than the sage and looking down on him with a curious yet distasteful glare. Nonetheless, Naruto wouldn't be intimidated. You call living like slaves a duty? Was his answer. Naruto wasn't a fool. The Great Chinese Migration happened for a reason, and while the blonde was willing to extend a hand of peace to the Taoists, he never had any illusions of the deplorable way they ruled and how it drove so many humans and humanoids to take refuge in his city. He'd made his position clear and for a while, became hopeful Okwang would see the error of their ways, especially when the latter had proposed an alliance. But does a cow not exist to provide nourishment? Does a human not exist to serve their betters? Does a god not exist to rule? He was such a fool. Brat, Naruto grinned up at the Prince of Natak. You and your ilk are the furthest things from deities. That answer earned him a thunderous fist to the cheek, followed by another that destroyed the ground behind him, followed by another boom. The sage's fist struck the god's stomach with such force, that the resulting shockwave tore apart the distant clouds above them. Arden leaned forward from the strike, his face contorting into shock before he slammed both feet to the ground and righted himself. He looked back at the blonde and smirked. My body's made of barbidium, the hardest substance in Hev. He was cut off by another powerful jab to the abdomen, almost heaving him off the ground and forcing the air out of him. Barbidium. No idea what that is, but it's pretty hard, commented the blonde as he felt his finger joints dislocate from the hit. A hard blow to the back was his answer, making him poof out in smoke, leaving a slab of rock in his place. Arden blinked before a pair of legs landed on his shoulders. A stab at his throat from a wind-enhanced knife did no damage, but prompted him to throw the man off with a blast of electricity. No sooner did Naruto land, did he strike forward with a punch, only for the white-haired deity to meet his fist with his own. The resulting clash tore the land asunder, even as both fighters remained in place. Arden disengaged and charged a tremendous amount of lightning into his fist, preparing for another punch. Shaw! Toop! Screamed the god, hurling his fist forward. Naruto, in response, took 1 foot back and used the greater range his leg provided him to strike Arden's chin, stopping him in his tracks. Semi-physical beings or not, they still got a brain to jostle, the sage thought simply, adjusting his stance. then with a poof of smoke, pulling out a more appropriate weapon, which he rammed into the frozen god's side, much to the latter's shock. Not sure Samaha'll be able to pierce his flesh, but at least it'll shave off some of his magic. Energy. Whatever, the blonde pondered as he readied the shark-skinned sword for another hit in the same place. Rumble. The blonde's golden eyes momentarily looked up at the forming storm clouds. I am the deity of fight, proclaimed the white-haired prince, his hand raised to the sky. Goo. Naruto hurriedly raised Samahata to block a sword of pure lightning held in Arden's hand. Guaaa. The sentient sword cried out in pain as, impossibly enough, his opponent's attack cut through its body and the land beneath their feet. The ground split open for miles behind them, while the sword screeched as the electrified blade pierced its scales. Was the attack too tough for Samahata to absorb? The sage resealed the sword immediately, not willing to risk its destruction here, before answering the attack with a powerful blade of wind. He's been favoring close combat this entire time due to the god's durability. The Rasenshuriken and its variants hadn't yielded many results, same with any long-range techniques, and yet. Maybe I wasn't being creative enough, he thought. He had a nigh infinite pool of domains to choose from, and yet he's been going back to his old tricks. An old dog he may be, but he was still the same unpredictable knucklehead he's always been. Plus, now that the survivors were evacuated and Zetsu was thankfully rescued by his aunts. Well. Speed. He slammed one foot into the ground. Strength. He slammed the opposite foot, taking a typical horse stance, with the orange tattoos now overtaking his entire body more visibly. Aanndd, that's how you do. He leaned down and dug his hands into the ground, grabbing a firm hold of it. Table flip. He yelled with a grin as he lifted the rubble, and subsequently the entirety of the land bridge before him, the ruined city included. Arden was dragged up with the wave of the earth until he felt himself fly near his father and the sage's other half. What in the world? He muttered, then focused and balanced himself in midair, halting his ascent. He looked around for a moment, tuning out the sounds of his father and the fool's other half's bombardment. Tilda bahahahaha tilde, his opponent's voice echoed through the sky. A flash of light caught Arden's eye. Huolin 3, the god, screamed out, as a flaming wheel of all things heeded his call, following his mental command and going through the surrounding rubble, turning rocks as large as building to dust instantly. He followed his weapon closely, before feeling an invisible force strike him in the chest. Ku. His white hair now dirty and frazzled, he looked around in confusion, only for a second and third strike to land on the back of his head and face respectively. Where are you? Fight me with some honor. King of Vermin, he screamed, looking through the rubble around him. Tilda bahahaha. What's the matter, tough guy? Never been swept off your feet before. Tilda, the sage annoyingly asked, still hidden somewhere. Cease your pleasantries and fight me as a warrior. Tilda well, ya see, I don't get too many occasions to show off a bit, especially this particular ability Tilda. The same blow from before appeared below the god, and before he could react, a thunderous uppercut slammed into his chin, throwing Arden back. Kakashi-sensei and Obito, eat our hearts out. This domain would have been the apex of your arsenal, thought Naruto with a feral grin. Space. He named the domain, before jumping into another tear in the air. Battle of Gyaran no Hankyochi, Part 5 . Connecticut, 29th of September, 2000. The ground erupted into a deep crater as a gigantic thunderbolt struck it. Following the attack, a smaller bolt struck the ground next to the hole. The light dissipated to reveal the imposing figure of Zeus, the king of Olympus. Although the god elected to go for a smaller form than the one he took on the mountain, he stood nonetheless at an impressive height of 6 feet 6 inches, putting him at exactly an inch taller than his elder brother. The god was not dressed in his usual dark blue pinstripe suit but went for a more practical route with his old toga. An outfit that both made him recognizable to anyone and allowed more freedom for movement. His glowing stormy blue eyes narrowed as he scanned the area before they landed on a dark blob at the edge of the smoking crater. Hades, the king spat out the name like a curse, to what do I owe the displeasure? The blob of solid darkness reabsorbed itself into a large black shield in the death god's hand. You never change, do you Zeus? Still as rash as ever, Hades glared back at the king who chortled at the jab. Do you think I didn't see the mess you've stirred up here? I will not have you or yours causing trouble in my land. The king's eyes sparked ominously. His gaze was met with the death god's own. The earth is my domain Zeus, go choke on your clouds, Hades spat derisively. Zeus narrowed his eyes as his weapon appeared in his hand. My domain overlooks all brothers, remember your place in the pecking order, he spoke, face set in a fierce scowl. The older brother looked back at the king, visage just as grim. He then scoffed and cracked his neck, that's rich coming from the reason people clap for a landing plane. How dare you? That quip obviously angered the toga-wearing deity, as he flashed forward towards his brother, until both gods stood face to face, weapons drawn up to the other threateningly. The stalemate remained for a few minutes, with the only sounds heard in the clearing being the sparking of the master bolt and the eerie howls coming from the death god's cloak. You've got some balls to crawl out of your hole, but I don't think you're foolish enough for another war, not after the last one, the younger brother whispered through gritted teeth. And many thanks for the millions of souls, dear brother of mine, they've made a fine addition to my forces. Hades' answer was smooth and delivered with a cold look. The god then looked ahead over his brother's shoulder to look at the destruction left in their wake, but as much as I'd like to continue prodding that fragile ego of yours, I'll ask that you stay your hand on this matter. The king snarled but composed himself with a deep breath, before asking calmly, oh. And why would I do that? After all the damage you and your accomplice have caused. His tone was accusatory and hid none of the suspicions he harbored. You might not realize this, Zeus, but fighting someone generally means I'm not affiliated with them. The exasperation could be felt in the death god's voice. Then who was that man? The one that called on my own son's domain. I'd think you of all people would have an axe to grind here, the king accused, making his point clear. Hades opened his mouth to reply, but just as the words formed in his mouth, he paused. His eyes widened as an unfamiliar yet dreadful feeling permeated throughout his body. He clicked his mouth shut, stepped back, and turned his back to his brother without a word. And just where do you think you're going? Zeus was obviously not done with Hades, and took a step forward, his weapon glowing. It's useless to talk with a brick wall. If you want answers, look in the house, I have other matters to attend to. The elder brother's answer was curt. Zeus narrowed his eyes fiercely, Hades, don't you dare. His words fell on deaf ears, as the lord of the underworld vanished. Brazil, Amazon forest, same time. A swirl of fire appeared atop a small hill, overlooking a portion of the lungs of the earth. From the fire a fully healed Zetsu and a calmer Hestia appeared, the latter taking her adult form and towering over the older immortal. Considering who they were likely to meet now, she felt the need to come looking a bit more proper. That, and she didn't really need a foreign immortal like Quetzalcoatl to make any comments right now. Speaking of, where were they? Rumble. The distant boom of thunder, accompanied by several tremors in the ground, answered her question. On there's Quatsi. Always one to make a scene, that girl, spoke to her companion, pointing a few clicks to the left. The eldest Olympian followed the finger and found the source of the noise. Well then. It wasn't every day one saw a skyscraper-tall Goliath wrestling an even longer rainbow-feathered serpent. The two tumbled around and shook the earth with their movement. The serpent, or Quatsi, as Zetsu has called her, was attempting to choke out the green-haired giant while the latter grabbed the goddess, long body and scratched away at her scales with razor-sharp claws. If one were to take away their size, the two wouldn't look too different from a pair of children roughhousing or fighting over a toy. She wouldn't lie though, the sight of little Zetsu, or a clone of him in this case, being about half the size of Typhon was very perplexing. There you are. He just turned in their direction. Shit, he sensed us. Hestia didn't bother scolding the other immortal for his potty mouth, considering the giant had pushed the serpent off of him and took off in their direction. Original. Ya ain't taking me back. I'm taking you. Another Zetsu screamed, the earth rumbling with each step he took. The brunette lit up her hand in Greek fire, preparing to defend her companion. Her flames had shown to be extremely effective on the Uzumaki before, although she didn't know if the same could be said for a super-sized version of brunette. She didn't have to, however, as the short immortal in question put his hand in front of her, stopping her. Looking at him questionably, she was met with the Uzumaki's hard stare. Zetsu, she questioned. Me and Quatzi'll handle this fool, go find Pan, he ordered. Last time I was able to sense him, his energy levels were ridiculously low. The shorter immortal then pointed to the right, he should be somewhere in that direction. Dunno where Quatzi put him, and I don't think she'll be answering any questions right now, he finished, pointing at his sister, who had ditched her earlier form and focused on flying around the clone and shooting lightning and flames at him. Why are you running? Tilda, why are you running? Tilda tienes miedo. Kahahaha. Hestia could make out the other goddess's distant taunts and laughter as the giant swatted at her like a fly. She looked between Zetsu and the approaching monster, deliberating in her head. Go. Zetsu screamed at her. She balked at the tone, but relented. Okay. Be careful. She turned away to teleport only for the greenette's hand to once again stop her. Wait. She turned in surprise, only to see a bizarre fruit in Zetsu's hand. Take this. We'll signal you if and when to use it, the Uzumaki explained hurriedly. Confused about the gesture, she hurriedly nodded, taking it, and disappearing in another swirl of fire. No sooner did Zetsu shift his gaze back to his clone, did he jump away from the latter's foot. This is gonna be tough, he thought, being pushed by the impact. As he flew back, his body glowed, green tattoos covering it in a manner similar to his father. This vacation fucking blows. Connecticut, Castellan residence, same time. Naruto whistled at the sight before him. Ria, who had stopped her spell, approached him from the side and let out an, oh, in wonder. Naruto's right hand tenderly cupped the cheek of May Castellan's soul, now free of the Oracle of Delphi, and returned to a light blue tint. His left hand gripped a struggling green soul that clawed at his arm in desperation. Hush now, Naruto lowered May's soul back into her body. He then shifted his other hand around the green soul, but before it could fly away, he proceeded to clap both hands with the oracle between them. The green soul found itself shrunken to a size that could fit between the sage's palms before it felt itself freeze in place. Ria raised an eyebrow in surprise as Naruto opened his hands to show the result of his work. Of all the things to emerge, she didn't expect to see a green poker chip, one with a frozen face inscribed into it. Why did this feel slightly familiar? The Titaness could have sworn she'd seen something similar in one of those Eastern comic books she'd taken to reading at Little Apollo's behest. Jar Jar or something. She only remembered it because of the number of jokes that spawned out of the series. And because Aphrodite's been planning a few fashion lines based on that. Go figure. Hey Rhea, she looked over to him and found him grinning at her. Does this count as me chipping in to help the family? The Blackett held a dainty hand to her mouth as she giggled, hoo Tilda. Delphi Netley. Naruto chuckled back before he paused suddenly and snapped his head to the door, getting Titaness' attention. Naruto dear, is there something wrong? Her question prompted a bead of sweat to form on the man's head. Promise you won't be mad. Rhea stared at him, her smile progressively shifting into a frown. What did you do now? He could make out an undertone of exasperation in her voice, one that unknowingly mimicked her eldest son's. Couple that with the same glare she reserved for her kids, and Naruto had buckled like a child with his hand in the cookie jar. Well, I technically didn't do anything, he mumbled, looking down at his Crocs to avoid the taller lady's gaze. Your clone, who by definition is a copy of you. Your clone that's been dragging my little moon pie around on a wild goose chase. That clone, Tilda. With every question, Naruto slumped further, until Rhea was pretty sure he'd fold in half. It was a funny sight, even if that man was a bit of a drama queen, like her youngest baby. Hey, still got it, she allowed herself an almost imperceptible smug smirk before the disappointment washed over her face again. Well, the Titaness prodded, leaning down with her hands on her hips. The sage childishly pouted, and let himself fall to the side, rolling his body around the ground in a circle, mumbling all the while. Rhea rolled her eyes even if she found the scene kind of cute, in a dorky way. Oh, for goodness sake, how old are you? She asked with a small giggle. The sage stopped his movement, sat up with his legs crossed, then grinned up at Rhea. I'm still in my too young 12,000. Naruto answered cheekily, looking up to his fellow parent, and locking eyes with her. Gold met emerald as both immortals had a brief staring contest. When the taller of the two wiggled her brows, the man puffed his cheeks, stifling a laugh of his own. Boom. The moment was interrupted by the entire house shaking, the same way it did earlier with Hades. Is that what you wanted to tell me? Hold on, the Titaness spread out her own senses, is that my little Sparky? SNRK. Oh, don't you give me that, Mr. Whiskers. You've got cute names for your kids too. She turned on the man, with a pout, only to receive a shrug. I mean sure, he said, smirking up at her, but at least I give him some cool nicknames too. Can't ruin their street cred and all. Not Zetsu though, the kid woulda murdered him in his sleep if he ever tried sticking a nickname on him. Not that his aunts haven't already. God knows Matabi or Kokuo might be the reason for the line of toys modeled after his son. Or Shukaku with that, Adventures of Zizi the Grumpy, show that he directed a few decades ago. Kids in Oreguk seem to like them, so whatever. Mr. Whiskers, are you there? His companion's voice cut through his thoughts. Huh, the sage blinked before the house shook once more. Boom. Alright, he answered, getting back on track. He got up and stretched his back, before looking at Rhea and giving her a foxy grin. Well, let's get this over with. Outside the house, same time Zeus had a lot of questions. Pushing aside his brother's abrupt departure, which he was still annoyed by, the sheer extraordinary nature of what he had witnessed in the last few minutes had thrown him for a loop. Clones were one thing, a purple barrier was another. That purple barrier being impenetrable through teleportation and even more blasphemously, able to take two hits, not one, of his master bolt was perplexing him. It wasn't like he held back that much either, he'd concentrated his power to minimize the radius of the explosion while maintaining its destructive charge. And after all that them damned barrier stood yet still. Mocking him. He wouldn't lie, his rage was simmering a tad. But there was also something else bubbling, deep within him. A hint of something he honestly hadn't felt since the Gigantomachi. Excitement. For a potentially good fight, that is, even if he knew it wasn't a wise move to seek conflicts with potentially strong beings like that. Mighty he might be, but a fool he was not. But in any case, he'll need to get to the bottom of this, so, with a sigh, he reared back his bolt once more, and just as he prepared to launch it once again, a voice echoed from inside the house. You four, let him in. A familiar voice. Mother, he found himself speaking unconsciously. For who else could it be but his dear loving parent? The four duplicates posted outside nodded at the request, paused, then nodded again before disappearing in a cloud of smoke each. Following that, the door to the house opened up with a flourish, letting the Titaness pass through. Sparky Tilda. Rhea heels clicked as she speed walked toward her son, arms open in anticipation of a hug. One that was quickly and gladly given by a now smiling Zeus, traces of his earlier anger and frustration having all but vanished. Oh, I missed you, baby Tilda. The mother's melodious voice only served to lull her son to calm down further. How's Hera been? Have you been giving my little Peachik trouble? I hope not. Rhea lightly pinched the god's bearded cheek while mockingly glaring at him. Fortunately for me, no, Zeus chuckled good-naturally, deciding to just enjoy the banter. His mother was among the only people, other than his wife, sisters, and daughters and some of his sons on rare occasions that he'd ever jest like so with. I've been trying to stay on her good side for the last few years after. You know, he said, mumbling the last part with a hint of guilt. Rhea nodded in response, no doubt remembering the tongue lashing she had given him following his latest demigod children's conception. She shook her head and disengaged from her embrace, looking down at her son. I know, but, as much as it pains me to cut this short, you must have some questions. Her statement reminded Zeus of his objective as he nodded. Yes, he confirmed. What's happening here, and what does Hades have to do with it? The god asked, his tone more professional. He saw his mother pause as if mentally balancing her words, before she grabbed his shoulder lightly. Look, son, before anything, let me just reassure you that there's no harm being done. She placated him, and some relief did fill him with her words. But what, or who, I want to show you, might not be someone you'd normally be willing to be civil with, but I need you to understand, there's no trouble to be had here, alright dear. Ray's explanation threw that earlier relief right out of the window and replaced it with alarm bells ringing throughout the god's head, as his mind worked overtime to decipher whatever mystery his parents were hiding behind that door. A lifetime of consuming theatrical entertainment, as well as his experience with some of his relatives in the past reared their heads, offering an unlikely result that Zeus honestly refused to believe. Because if what he was thinking right now was the truth, he might as well blow up the entire state to ensure it does not come to pass. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. But damn it, it made sense. That unknown ability, Hades' presence. Say what you want about his brother, but he would have done the same in this situation. As would Poseidon. What was at stake here was immeasurably precious after all. But he needed to make sure. Mother, please, the king's tone was begging, his eyes wide and disbelieving, please tell me you're not getting remarried. Rhea blinked owlishly, opening and closing her mouth to formulate the words, her cheeks lightly dusting a golden color before she bit her lips. Some air escaped through her nose. Pffffffffff hoo 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 ha 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 ha. And then his mother, the calm, composed and very image of poise, Rhea, exploded into laughter. She wasn't alone, though. Bahahahahahaha. Zeus, even while holding his hysterical mother, was able to make out the second set of laughter from within the house. As if to prove whatever theories he had right, a man slid out from behind the door, face red and seemingly losing his grip on it and rolling down the driveway as he cackled listlessly at whatever joke Zeus might have said. The god narrowed his eyes at the stranger, his eyes picking up every detail they could about him while his mind went into overdrive cross-referencing the latter with any memories he had, anything to help identify this individual. Blonde hair, tan skin, a built frame, some peculiar whisker-like tattoos, or were they scars? On his cheeks, and a strangely familiar tattoo pattern that overtook the man's body. Then, he sensed his power and his mind immediately went blank. A single memory was recalled. An old meeting, one of the few he'd had with his Norse and Egyptian counterparts over one thing or another, where a particularly dangerous subject has been brought up. When it comes to the East, I propose a coalition, Odin had said, even as Ra scoffed at the notion. While the main pantheons might seem content within their borders now, there does exist a gallery of unnaturally strong and unaffiliated individuals which we ought to be wary of, the wizened Norse king explained before the god had summoned some paintings depicting the people in question. A horned figure, reminiscent to Abrahamic depictions of the so-called devil, spreading misery around them. Mara, Buddhist Hindu demon lord of desires, known as the Evil One. A fox-like creature, depicted with tails the size of mountains, causing natural disasters with but a flick of those appendages. The nine-tailed fox demon, described as a veritable force of nature comparable to a primordial. And finally, a humanoid figure, drawn as a laughing man with orange tattoos, clashing with a three-eyed deity that Zeus had recognized as the Jade Emperor. The king of savages, and the one who dared oppose the heavenly bureaucracy. The one who destroyed the Taoist underworld. Is this why Hades was here? His following actions were born out of reflex. With a sweeping hand, he pushed his mother aside, snapping her out of her laughter. Zeus, wait, the Titaness screamed, balancing herself and seeing his master bolt charge up to full power. Baha, ha, ha. The man noticed the weapon's glow, pausing in his laughter. Die. The king let loose his attack. The bolt flew, vibrating the air as it went, and Zeus saw the man mouth a single word in response. He sat up on his side and brought out a hand in a chopping motion. Space. He screamed as a tear in the air formed before the man, the supercharged attack getting absorbed into it. What? Thought the king as another bolt formed in his hand, ready to attack again, only to drop it as he felt an intense pain in his ear. His mother had reached him first and expressed her frustration with him appropriately by almost twisting his ear off. Hold your damn horses, boyo. The man got up from the ground and yelled at him. Zeus, Oas, could you listen to me just once before acting rashly? Rhea added her 2 cents, with one hand holding her hip, while the other gripped her son's ear hard enough to turn it purple. He let out some air from his nostrils, unwilling to let the pain show on his face. I acted within my right. He defended himself. Are you out of your mind, mother? You brought one of the most dangerous beings on the planet to my duo. Said Mother twisted his ear even more. Ooh, beautiful technique Ria, never seen someone do it this well. Have ya thought about patenting it? I know a guy. The man, monster, or whatever he was seemed to enjoy the king's pain as he began laughing. Zeus felt a small bit of betrayal when his only parent, the one he'd always cherished, laughed alongside the man. Ooh tilde ou. We'll talk about this later. For now, let's solve this issue. Without senseless destruction, she added the last part with an additional twist making the god bite his lip. But mother, he protested. No buts. The only butt I want to see is yours on a chair, young man. She gestured once again to the house, pulling him along as the blond man laughed again. Zeus gritted his teeth but agreed solemnly. Okay. He glared murderously at who he knew was the gallant sage of the East as he passed his cackling form. Whatever Hades had to deal with, I hope it's more trouble than this, he griped. Earlier. When Naruto saw he'd be facing the local death god, and one of the big three, at that, he knew he'd be outmatched. This was why he was acting up like a fool, stall for a maximum of time by making the god underestimate him. That, and because it was funny. What can he say? People rarely took him seriously as a kid because of his antics, and he'd long since learned to weaponize that annoying characteristic of his. Plus, he needed a story hilarious enough to finally get that stick in the mud Shinigami to crack a smile. That one was the type to enjoy watching paint dry. But in any case, Naruto already knew the result of this fight. There was no way in hell he could overpower a chief god level opponent as he was. Even reinforced clones carried but a fraction of the original's full power. In his case, that fraction amounted to a measly 5%, with strengthened durability that'd allow him to receive a dozen good hits before popping, as opposed to the usual one. That was also why he'd brought out Samahata. The sword had long ago become a helpful tool in fights against immortals. The sentient weapon had grown used to the various frequencies of energy that dominated the universe, but found the immortals' own brand of magic, as they called it, to be a delicacy. In a sense, every domain produced a certain energy frequency, almost indistinguishable from others because of the sheer number of those sources. Chakra was just one of the many names that energy possessed and existed as several frequencies on the spectrum, from his regular chakra, to nature or sage chakra, to his sibling's demonic chakra. He didn't know how else to summarize it. It had taken him several centuries to even understand the basics of this stuff. But anyway. The minute he'd been told the original had all but finished, Naruto decided to get a bit more serious. Both to coax his opponent to do the same, and hopefully to carry the fight away from the house. This would naturally make him extremely visible to this pantheon's deities, but at this point, they were already in the endgame. He accounted for some other gods to show up to assist Hades, of course. He just didn't expect the king to simply blast him with no questions asked. Luckily, he still had plenty of tricks up his sleeve, so within the milliseconds before getting hit by the bolt, he established a connection with the domain he desired and uttered its name. Space, he said as the world warped around him just as the attack engulfed him. Unknown location. Phew, close call, thought Naruto, his face puffed out and visibly holding his breath, even as a few of his hairs were singed. He was floating in a void, one that would look familiar yet puzzling to any avid observer of the cosmos. A multitude of stars peppered the black background, each impossibly far away. This was, after all, the space beyond the veils, the true, outer space that humans had been seeking to explore and conquer lately. It was also the space that separated the Earth from the outer layer of the universe, beyond which lay the one above all's realm. Now where is this place? The clone scanned the space around him, floating some ways off of what could be identified as Earth, and looking at several odd planets around him. Those were other realms, ones that existed in the form of pocket dimensions within the one universe that englobed everything. Each realm appeared as a sort of astral body, even if it would be more apt to call it a bubble floating in nothing. Deities and some creatures linked to those realms could access them instantly. As for him or the boss, they needed to physically look for their target before establishing a link there. But nevertheless, enough exposition. He needed to find the closest realm that radiated the same energy signature as the death domain. He swam forward, passing by what looked like stone remains of small moons, some with large holes in them, while others were simple crescents or completely shattered. Those things are still here, he pondered, shifting to a backstroke as he passed by the bizarre sight. He turned around and extended his senses once more, feeling out the energy pathways that linked each realm to another. Now if I were the Greek afterlife, where would I found ya? He grinned mischievously as he caught sight of the realm in question, as a wicked plan of action formed in his head. He proceeded to breaststroke his way to a golden and gray planet, its layer making it impossible to view anything inside. It didn't take long to reach it and land on the hard outer layer of the realm. Using his control over space, he plunged both hands into the layer in question, and pushed them aside, creating a tear in the realm. Banzai. As he jumped through the closing hole, he reflected on what he'd just done, and what he intended to do next. Would the boss get angry at him? Nah, he'll just have a little fun. Just a little. Ain't like this was his first rodeo. Bahahaha. The cackle echoed through the underworld and sent shivers down its inhabitants' spines.